The morning in downtown San Francisco came in cold and silver. The Booker Meridian Tower rose 64 floors into a slate sky, its glass face washed pale by the early light. Inside the marble lobby, footsteps echoed across the polished floor as employees in tailored suits crossed toward elevators they had earned the right to use. Almost nothing in the building remembered why it had been built. A man in a charcoal coat stepped through the revolving door. He was 29 years old, tall, broad in the shoulders, his dark skin warmed by the lobby's pale light, and tired in a way that had less to do with sleep than with what he was carrying. His white shirt was slightly wrinkled. His leather shoes were worn down at the heels. A thin silver band sat on his left ring finger, the kind of band a widower keeps wearing not out of habit, but out of conversation with someone no longer there. In one hand, he held a worn leather folder. In the other, the small hand of a 6-year-old girl in a pale blue cardigan. The girl was Zora Booker. Her hair had been carefully parted that morning and pulled into 2 neat box braids, each one finished with a small wooden bead. A faint scent of shea butter still clung to her edges. She held the same stuffed rabbit her mother had once tucked under her arm in a hospital nursery. She looked up at the great silver letters on the wall and read the name slowly to herself. Then she tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy, is this the company Mommy used to talk about?" Elijah Booker paused. Booker Meridian. He had not stood in this lobby in 5 years. He nodded once and squeezed her hand. Behind the desk, Margaret Whitfield looked up. She was 58, with silver hair pinned neatly behind her ears. The moment she saw him, her hands stilled on the keyboard. She knew him by the way he settled his hand on the small shoulder beside him. But Margaret said nothing. She had worked long enough in this building to understand that some men only walked back through their own doors as strangers when they had a reason to. Elijah said he had a scheduled interview for an entry-level operations analyst position. The name on the calendar was not his real name. Margaret handed him a visitor badge and gestured to the waiting area. He thanked her and led Zora over. They sat together on a long bench. At first, Zora watched the elevators rise and fall. As the minutes passed, her curiosity faded. People in tailored suits walked by without looking at them. A young assistant glanced at Elijah's worn shoes, then at the color of his hands, then looked away a little faster than she should have. 10 minutes passed, 20, 40, an hour. No one offered them water. No one asked the child if she was hungry. Elijah took a small package of crackers from his pocket and gave it to her. She ate carefully, but a few crumbs fell. A passing assistant frowned. "This is not a daycare," she said quietly and walked on. Elijah bent down without a word and gathered the crumbs into his palm. It is worth pausing here for a moment. There is a quiet test that every lobby in the world performs without announcing itself. The test is not whether a building can welcome the powerful. Any building can do that. The test is whether a building can keep its manners when the visitor looks like he has nothing to offer. Most fail that test, and the failure is rarely loud. It arrives as a glance held a second too long, a chair not offered a question, not asked. A child notices these things before she has the language for them. And what a child notices, a child remembers. Beyond the glass wall, an executive meeting was already in progress. Vivian Hale sat at the head of the table, 28 years old, her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders, a cream V-neck dress, a calm and distant expression. To her right, Preston Ashcroft, 48, polished, holding a fountain pen between 2 fingers, as if it were a small, impatient weapon. Across from him, Garrett Hollister, 45, leaned back with the easy contempt of a man who believed every room belonged to him. Garrett glanced through the glass and saw the man on the bench and the little girl with the rabbit. His mouth curled. "Another desperate father," he said just loud enough for the others to hear, "who thinks a button-down shirt is an executive credential." A few directors laughed. Zora heard. She lowered her head and pressed the rabbit harder against her chest. Elijah did not look up, but his fingers closed slowly on the leather folder the way a man closes his hand on something he has decided not to drop. Almost an hour had passed. Zora was tired and hungry. She tried to sit up straight. She tried not to be a bother. But when the laughter came again from behind the glass wall, she felt small in a way she had not felt before. She tugged her father's sleeve. "Daddy," she said softly, "do they not like us?" The question struck Elijah harder than any insult of his own ever had. He could endure mockery aimed at himself, but Zora was not supposed to learn that her father deserved this kind of treatment. Just then, Garrett Hollister stepped out of the conference room with two other directors. He walked slowly past the bench and stopped in front of Elijah. "You are the candidate for the analyst slot," he asked. Elijah looked up calmly. "I am." Garrett glanced at Elijah's worn shoes, then at Zora. "Friendly advice," he said loud enough for the lobby to hear. "If you want anyone to believe you have a future here, do not bring small children to a corporate office, and do not wear a suit that looks like it came out of a donation bin." A few people laughed. The laughter was not loud, but in a quiet lobby it traveled. Zora's face turned hot. Her voice trembled. "Daddy's suit is not ugly." A grown man somewhere should have been ashamed. Garrett only laughed harder. "At least the kid is loyal." Zora's eyes filled with tears. She bent her head down so that the rabbit covered her mouth. Elijah laid his hand on her shoulder. His silence changed. It was no longer the silence of observation. It was the silence of a decision being made. If there is one lesson worth carrying out of this first hour, it is this. Teach a child what to do when the world is unkind to her before you teach her how to impress the world. Because impressing the world is a skill she will pick up on her own. Surviving the world without losing her softness is the harder art, and it is learned at the elbow of the parent who refuses to flinch. 10 years before, none of this glass had existed. There had only been a small rented warehouse outside Denver, a man in greasy work clothes, and a woman named Imani who refused to let him give up. Elijah Booker had not been born to comfort. He had grown up in a small Colorado town where his father, a tall man with grease, worked permanently into the lines of his knuckles, repaired engines 6 days a week, and on Sundays sang baritone in a church with a leaking roof. His mother worked nights as a nurse at the county hospital and braided her son's hair on Saturday mornings before he was old enough to ask her to stop. He had earned his engineering degree on a scholarship and 3 jobs at once. What he had always believed was that technology only earned its name when it served the people no one bothered to count. His first design had been a clean energy storage system, meant to keep the lights on in rural hospitals, in country schools, in towns that storms tended to forget. He had grown up in one of those towns. He knew what it meant when the power went out on the night an old woman was on oxygen. He had met Imani in the cafeteria of a small public hospital where she worked as a pediatric social worker. She was a tall woman with a low, steady voice and a laugh that arrived without warning. She was not a businesswoman. She did not know how to raise capital, but she believed him. When his first investor turned him down and Elijah came home ready to quit, Imani had looked across the kitchen table and said simply, "If what you are building can keep an emergency room lit, then it is worth continuing." When the rent on the warehouse came due, she had sold her car so they could pay it. Jamal Reeves had been Elijah's closest friend since college, a quiet, blunt engineer whose loyalty did not announce itself. The 3 of them had slept on the warehouse floor in those first months. They had eaten cold meals. They had rebuilt circuits at 3 o'clock in the morning. They had survived on faith in something many serious men had told them was impossible. When the prototype finally worked, Booker Meridian was born. The press called Elijah a young genius. He always corrected them. The company had been built by Imani's belief, by Jamal's stubborn intelligence, and by the sweat of those who had stayed when leaving would have been wiser. There is a particular kind of company that gets built by people who have known what it is to do without. They build differently. They do not chase prestige first. They chase the lights coming on in places that have been dark for a long time. And when that kind of company forgets where it came from, it does not simply lose its direction. It loses the very reason it had a right to exist. Then the bad year came. When Zora was very small, Imani died of a complication that had nothing in it of mercy. A year later, Jamal Reeves was killed in a testing accident at a remote lab. 2 losses in 12 months. Elijah did not have the strength left to stand at the center of anything. He stepped back. He handed daily operations to Preston Ashcroft, to Garrett Hollister, to the leadership team Jamal had once helped recruit. He kept his controlling share. He kept the founder's emergency clause buried in the corporate charter. But he disappeared from public view. For 5 years, he lived the life of an ordinary father. He learned to part Zora's hair into careful sections the way his mother had once parted his. He learned which oils her scalp liked and which made her cry on wash day. He drove her to kindergarten. He read her stories before sleep. He fixed cars in the garage on Saturdays the way his father had taught him, and on Sunday nights he made simple dinners she could help stir his mother's smothered chicken when he had the time, grilled cheese when he did not. To the world, he was the missing billionaire who had walked away. To Zora, he was simply the man who was always there when she woke from a bad dream. The night the email came, the house on the hill was very quiet. Zora was already asleep, her rabbit tucked under her chin. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, his coffee cooling beside him. On the screen, he had opened an old video clip. Imani in their first warehouse, her hair wrapped in a printed scarf, dust on her hands, laughing and saying that one day Booker Meridian would keep the lights on in places the rich never thought about. A new message blinked at the corner of the screen. The sender was unnamed. The subject line was a single sentence. "They're selling what Imani died believing in." Elijah stared at the words for a long time before he opened the message. Inside were 21 attached files. Closed session minutes, side contracts, budget transfers, internal correspondence, and almost finished sale agreement to a corporation called Iron Veil Energy. He read until the sky outside began to turn pale. The picture that emerged was patient and cruel. Preston Ashcroft and Garrett Hollister had been preparing to sell Booker Meridian to Iron Veil Energy, a fossil fuel conglomerate that had circled the company for years. The price was more than 40% below true value. After the sale, Iron Veil intended to shut down the Clean Energy Research Division, lay off hundreds of engineers, and keep the patents only to prevent rivals from using them. Every project Imani had cared about would die. The backup battery system for rural hospitals, the grid for underfunded schools, the disaster recovery program for storm-broken communities. None of these had been line items to her. They had been the reason the company existed. Preston was scheduled to receive a personal payout of $95 million if the deal closed. Garrett was promised a board seat at Iron Veil. Worse, the directors had spent 18 months quietly cutting research budgets so that Booker Meridian would look weak on paper, weak enough to justify a cheap sale. The sender was Wesley Bennett, a mid-level financial analyst, 31 years old. Wesley had noticed irregularities while reconciling vendor accounts. He had traced shell companies missing approvals, repeated payment codes. He had not dared report it internally. He had not dared trust the board. The only person he had been able to think of was the founder. Elijah did not call the press. Public noise would let Preston erase the trail. He did not call the board either because he did not yet know which members had been bought. He decided he had to walk into the building himself as a stranger and see what the company had become. There is something to be said for the kind of grief that takes a man out of the world for a while. It is not weakness. It is the body refusing to keep up an act it cannot afford. But there is also a cost to staying gone. Whatever a good person steps away from someone less good will quietly step into. The work of returning is harder than the work of never having left. It is also sometimes the only honest work a person has left to do. In the morning, Zora saw him take an old charcoal coat from the back of the closet. It was the coat he had worn to his first investor pitch. She asked him where he was going. Elijah said he had business in San Francisco. She asked if she could come because school was closed. He was about to say no. Then she said, "Mommy said that company is part of our family too." The words struck a place in him he had been avoiding for 5 years. He brought her with him because she was the reason he could no longer let her mother's name be sold. Elijah had registered for the interview under a false name and an entry-level title. He wanted to feel the company the way a person without standing felt it. A place that had remained decent would treat the least important visitor with the same dignity as the most important. When he and Zora arrived at the lobby, he used none of his old privileges. From the bench, while Zora swung her feet quietly, Elijah watched. An older custodian was asked to clean faster and step out of the way before an investor's tour passed through. A young assistant was scolded in the open lobby for printing a folder cover in the wrong shade of blue. An engineer in a lab coat was stopped by a security guard from boarding the executive elevator because the guard explained today there were guests of importance upstairs. The culture had moved from respecting people to worshiping image. The building no longer felt like the company he and Imani and Jamal had built. Zora leaned close. "Why is nobody smiling, Daddy?" He did not have a true answer. He said gently, "They are busy, sweetheart." But he knew it was not busyness. It was coldness pretending to be discipline. Inside the glass conference room, Preston was presenting what he called a strategic restructuring. He used careful words: asset optimization, shareholder protection, reduced research risk. Underneath each phrase was the same simple fact: he was selling the company to Iron Vale. Vivienne Hale sat at the head of the table because the board had wanted a young, sharp face for the press. She believed she was steering the company through a delicate moment. She did not know that Preston was showing her only summaries that had been carefully cleaned. She did not know that the dirty clauses lived in appendices she had never seen. When Vivienne glanced through the glass and saw the man on the bench with a child beside him, her brow tightened with the small displeasure of someone who believed this was unprofessional. Preston caught her expression and used it. "That kind of personal sentiment," he said quietly, was the weakness of the Elijah Booker era. Too many feelings, too many family stories. This company has finally grown up. Vivienne said nothing. She had been told too often by men older than her that softness was a vulnerability she could not afford. So she had taught herself to be colder than the men around her, certain that this was the only road to authority. She did not yet see how that coldness had begun to make her blind. Vivienne stepped out of the conference room because the noise had begun to attract attention. She looked at Elijah. She looked at Zora. For a moment, something in her face flickered, as if the cold layer had been touched. But Preston was standing behind her, watching how she would handle it, and she was a young woman who had spent every working day refusing to look uncertain. "Sir," she said evenly, "this is the executive floor. If you cannot maintain a professional environment, we will need to ask you to leave." Elijah looked at her steadily. He did not raise his voice. "Is professional?" he asked. The word for letting a 6-year-old hear a grown man insult her father. Vivienne hesitated. The question went straight into a place she had not let anyone touch in years. But instead of an answer, she chose composure, the kind that costs the most. Garrett turned to a security officer. "Escort him out." 2 guards took a step forward. Zora gasped and pressed her face against her father's coat. Elijah crouched to her eye level. He wiped the tears from her cheek with the side of his thumb. "Stand with Miss Margaret for a moment," he said softly. "Daddy is not going to let this place become your worst memory." The guards stepped closer. Elijah did not resist. He simply looked once at Vivienne and asked her quietly, "Is the meeting to approve the sale of this company already underway?" Every voice in the lobby fell off at once. Vivienne's eyes sharpened. "Excuse me." Elijah did not answer. He took the visitor badge from around his neck and pressed it gently into Margaret's palm. Then he looked at Zora. Margaret left her place behind the desk and walked around to the bench. She held out her hand to the little girl. "Stay with me, sweetheart," she said. "Your daddy knows what he is doing." Zora was still afraid, but she nodded. Elijah stood and walked toward the conference room. Garrett gestured at the guards to stop him. Elijah reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small black metal card. The card carried a charter authentication code, the kind issued only to founders and controlling shareholders. The lead guard saw the card and his face changed. He stepped back at once. Garrett's voice rose. "What are you doing? Block him!" No one moved. Elijah pushed open the conference room door. The entire upper power structure of Booker Meridian was there. Garrett Hollister, Vivian Hale, the general counsel, 2 members of the board of directors, 3 senior officers, 2 representatives from Iron Veil Energy. On the table, the final draft of the sale agreement was waiting for signatures. Garrett followed him in, trying to recover the room. "You have no right to be in here." Elijah did not look at him. He walked the length of the table to the seat at the head, the seat that had been left empty out of habit. He set his old leather folder down. The sound was small, but absolute. Preston Ashcroft turned. His annoyance lasted only a few seconds. Then his face went white. He had seen this man before. He had seen this jaw, this stillness, this pair of eyes. He recognized the founder he had once told the press had stepped away forever. Vivian did not understand yet. She only saw a man she had ordered out of her lobby walking into her boardroom with a calm that was not hers to grant. Elijah opened the folder. He took out the founder's card and laid it down beside Preston's draft contract. The card was simple black engraved in clean white letters. Elijah Booker, founder, controlling shareholder, charter authority holder. The general counsel rose so quickly that his pen rolled to the floor. Vivian stared at the card and her face went pale. Garrett's mouth opened and closed without words. Elijah looked at no one in particular. His voice was even. "I sat outside that door for an hour," he said, "long enough to understand that this company is not only being sold, it has been broken from the inside." The silence that followed was not a pause. It was the sound of a room realizing the ground beneath it had moved. What followed took 6 minutes. Later, those who had been in the room would describe it the way survivors describe a precise storm. There was no shouting. There was only the steady hand of a man who had decided the time for silence was finished. In the first minute, Elijah presented identification. The general counsel ran the card against the company's authentication system. The system confirmed his status as founder, controlling shareholder, and charter authority holder. Preston tried to push back. He said, with the smooth confidence he had perfected over 20 years, that Elijah had been absent from operations for too long to interfere now. Elijah did not raise his voice. "I do not need a corner office to know when a company is being betrayed." In the second minute, Elijah laid the Iron Veil Energy sale agreement on the table. He turned the page that listed the transaction price. The number was 40% below the company's true valuation. One of the Iron Veil representatives reached for the document. Elijah set his hand on it. "Do not touch it. The original is already at 3 different law firms." The room understood in that moment that he had not arrived to threaten. He had arrived prepared. In the third minute, Elijah exposed Preston. He produced the personal payout agreement of $95 million, then a second sheet showing wire transfers to a consulting shell whose principals shared addresses with members of Preston's family. Preston tried to laugh. He called it a post-merger advisory structure. Elijah turned the page calmly. The next sheet was an email Preston had written in his own words, instructing a deputy that the company's valuation would need to be softened before the contract was signed. A senior director on the far side of the table stood up and began to walk toward the door. Elijah did not look up. "Sit down. Your name is on page 14. The director sat. In the 4th minute, Elijah exposed Garrett. He laid out the systematic budget cuts to research the postponed community projects, the redirected funds that had landed at affiliated subcontractors. Garrett lost his composure. He shouted that Elijah had abandoned the company, that he had no right to judge anyone who had stayed. Elijah looked at him for the first time directly. I left this company to raise my daughter after I buried her mother. You stayed to sell what her mother believed in. Do not confuse those two things." The room went very still. It was not only a rebuttal, it was a verdict. In the 5th minute, Elijah set in front of Vivian a contract appendix that bore an electronic version of her signature. She read it. The clause was not in any summary she had ever approved. Preston had used her acting authority to legitimize provisions she had never seen while keeping the side agreements out of her sight. Her hand began to tremble for the first time. She understood with a slow and final clarity that she had not been steering this ship. She had been the figurehead at its bow. In the 6th minute, Elijah drew out the Founder Emergency Reinstatement Clause. The clause had been written into the company's charter on the night it had first been incorporated. It allowed the founder to retake operational authority immediately if the company was found to be the target of fraud, undervalued sale, or betrayal of its founding mission. He took out a silver pen that had belonged to Imani. He signed the reinstatement order in front of every witness in the room. Then he laid down a stack of termination notices. Preston Ashcroft Garrett Hollister and every director whose name appears in these appendices, your operational authority ends now. Garrett shouted that this was illegal. Preston threatened lawsuits. Elijah answered without ceremony. Sue, Discovery will let the country know what you have done. The security team entered the room. This time they did not approach Elijah. They approached Preston Garrett and the other named directors. As Garrett was led past the glass wall, he saw Zora standing beside Margaret. She had stopped crying. She watched him walk past with the steady look of a child who did not yet understand everything, but understood enough to know that something had shifted in the world. When the room emptied, the silence remained. No one applauded. No one dared speak first. There is a moment in any quiet betrayal when the people who carried it out begin to believe their own version of the story. They believe that what they took was owed to them. They believe that the founder is too far away to ever return. They believe that the original mission was a slogan, not a promise. That belief becomes a kind of fog inside a building. And sometimes the only thing that clears the fog is one person walking back through the front door without permission and without apology. We do not often get to choose when that moment arrives. But we do choose every working day whether we will be the kind of person who quietly sets the trail of breadcrumbs that will one day call the founder home. Before the next chapter unfolds, one small thought is worth pausing on. Whatever you build with your life, whether it is a company or a household or a name your children will one day carry, build it on something that can be defended out loud. Because there will come a day when someone will try to sell it cheaply while you are not in the room. And the only thing that will save it is whether the people you trained, the people you fed, the people you treated well, still remember why it was built. Decency is not soft. Decency is the long memory of a thing that survives. The reversal had happened quickly, but the consequences would unfold for months. Vivienne did not weep. She did not plead. She did not rush to apologize. She was a proud woman, and pride does not break itself easily. But the cold layer that had held her face together for years had cracked, and through the crack, a different expression was beginning to appear. She looked at the documents in front of her. Then she looked through the glass at the bench where Zora still held the rabbit, where Margaret still had a steady hand on the child's shoulder. Elijah asked her evenly, "How much did you know Vivian was quiet for several seconds?" "Not enough, and that was my failure." Her answer did not erase the harm she had let happen, but it told Elijah what kind of person she was. Vivian was not Preston. She had been used. That did not make her innocent. It also did not make her irredeemable. Elijah slid a second folder across the table. Inside it were the records that proved how Preston had managed her. Meeting calendars, rearranged full contracts, withheld edited summaries, delivered to her desk, some of her electronic signatures attached to appendices she had never read. If the deal had broken in public, Vivian would have been the face the press destroyed first. A memory came to her then. Her father, decades earlier, standing outside a Pennsylvania factory with a paper box of his belongings after nearly 30 years of service. She had been small then. She had told herself that day that she would grow up to be the kind of person who never let her family be discarded by anyone again. Yet here, she had stood beside men who had treated a father in front of his child the way her father had once been treated. Vivian stood. She turned to the general counsel and the remaining board members. I am formally requesting that the Iron Veil transaction be frozen immediately, that an independent investigation be opened, and that emergency operational authority be granted to Mr. Booker until that review is complete. One of the directors objected. He warned that the stock would fall. Vivian looked at him without flinching. If our share price needs a lie to stay upright, then it has already collapsed. The line passed through the room without resistance. From that minute on, Vivienne was not the cold woman from the lobby. She was not yet forgiven, but she had begun to make herself worthy of being heard. The news leaked within 20 minutes. Someone in the conference room had typed quickly, and the financial press did not need to be coaxed. The reclusive founder had returned. He had walked into his own building unrecognized. He had cleared his executive floor in a single morning. The stock began to fall before the lunch hour. Investors panicked. Some employees believed Elijah had saved the company. Others believed he had lost his mind after years of seclusion. Still others believed Iron Veil would sue and that Booker Meridian would not survive the year. Preston and Garrett fought back fast. They hired counsel. They circulated quiet statements suggesting that Elijah had been gone too long to understand the modern market, that he had acted on emotion connected to the death of his wife. They even hinted that he had brought his small daughter into the lobby that morning to manufacture a sympathetic image, and a few of those statements carried a quieter, uglier suggestion, underneath a familiar implication that an angry black man with a grievance was always somehow performing his pain rather than carrying it. Elijah had won the boardroom. He had not yet won the war. Firing the men who had betrayed the company did not automatically heal it. The shock had only begun. That evening, Elijah did not go home. Zora fell asleep on a long sofa in a side office, her rabbit tucked against her chest. Margaret brought a soft blanket and laid it over the child without making a sound. Elijah stood in the doorway and watched his daughter sleep. He asked himself if it had been wrong to bring her here. Then he remembered the look in her eyes when the laughter had come through the glass wall. He understood that if he had stayed silent today, she would have grown up remembering that her father had bowed his head to people who did not deserve to keep their seats. Vivian stayed too. She took off her heels and pulled her blazer over her shoulders. She sat with Elijah in a small conference room and worked through the documents page by page. The silence between them was tense, but it was honest. She was a person trying late to do the work she had skipped. What they discovered was worse than they had thought. The research division had been hollowed out. 5 lead engineers had drafted resignation letters. A backup power project for a rural hospital network was on the edge of cancellation for lack of funds. Several small suppliers had not been paid for months, while their invoices had been redirected to a fake consulting firm. Vivian finally asked in a low voice, "Why did you not come back sooner?" Elijah looked at his sleeping daughter through the glass. "Because there are seasons when a father only has the strength left to save one child, not a whole company too." Vivian did not answer. For the first time, she saw him not as a billionaire and not as a founder. She saw him as a man who had survived the kind of losses that change what a person believes is possible. Late that night, Wesley Bennett was called up to the 60th floor. He came in nervous, certain he was about to be fired for sending the anonymous email. Elijah stood and shook his hand. "You did what an entire executive floor was too afraid to do. You told the truth." Wesley did not know what to say. He simply pressed his lips together and nodded. "If you take only one thing from the long night in that office, take this. The world will sometimes ask you to choose between being the parent your child needs and being the person your work needs. There is no clean answer to that choice. But the answer most often worth living with is the one that allows you years later to look your child in the eye and tell her the truth about what you did and why. Power that costs you that conversation is not power. It is a loan against your own heart, and the interest comes due. The next morning, Elijah called an all-company meeting. The broadcast went out to every office. San Francisco to Seattle, Denver, Dallas, Boston, the regional branches. Some employees thought the company was going under. Some feared mass layoffs. Some thought the founder would deliver a sharp speech and disappear back into the shadow he had lived in for 5 years. Elijah walked onto the stage in the same charcoal coat he had worn the day before. He did not change into a finer suit to prove anything. He wanted the people who worked at Booker Meridian to see him as he was. Zora sat in the front row with Margaret. Vivienne stood off to the side, ready to step forward if she was needed. Elijah did not begin with numbers. He began with a story. He told them about a rented warehouse outside Denver. He told them about Imani selling her old car to keep the lights on. He told them about Jamal Reeves sleeping under a workbench to watch a pressure test through the night. He told them why Booker Meridian had been founded. Not to become the largest company in sector, but to keep the lights on in places that the rest of the world had a habit of forgetting. The kind of places he had grown up in. The kind of places where his own father had once driven across 2 counties in a snowstorm to fix a generator at a clinic so a child on a ventilator could keep breathing. Then he did something not all founders do. He admitted his own fault. I once thought that holding a controlling stake was enough to protect a company. I was wrong. A company is not protected by paperwork. It is protected by the people who every day choose to do the right thing. The line landed gently. He was not trying to be a hero. He was a man taking responsibility for his absence. He announced 3 decisions. The first was that the entire Iron Veil Energy transaction was canceled. The second was that an independent investigation would begin at once, and all evidence of fraud would be transferred to the appropriate authorities. The third was that the research budget would be fully restored with priority given to the projects that had originally given the company its purpose. The hospital backup grids, the school energy programs, the disaster recovery initiatives in small communities that had quietly been written out of the plan. He spoke to the staff plainly. If you wish to leave, you may leave with dignity. If you stay, you must understand that this company will no longer be run on fear, on contempt, or on agreements made behind closed doors. For a long moment, the room was still. Then Wesley Bennett stood up. Then Margaret stood. Then an older engineer in the 3rd row. Then more until almost the entire room was on its feet. Vivienne walked up to the stage. She stood beside Elijah, but not in front of him. The polished hardness she had worn for years was gone. I was wrong to believe that coldness was competence. I let a father be humiliated in front of his daughter inside this company. I will not hide that mistake. From this day, if I am still standing in this building, I will stand on the side of those who protect the truth. Zora watched her. She did not understand everything an adult had just said, but she understood the simplest thing. A grown person had said sorry. There is something quietly radical about an adult apologizing in front of a child. Most children grow up never seeing it. They grow up watching adults defend themselves, explain themselves, blame other adults, blame the times, blame anyone but the person in the mirror. And then we are puzzled that those children grow into adults who cannot apologize either. A child who sees an apology offered cleanly is given a piece of furniture they will use for the rest of their lives. Vivienne, without knowing it, had just handed Zora that piece of furniture. 2 months passed. The investigation confirmed what the documents had suggested. Preston Ashcroft, Garrett Hollister, and the implicated directors were named in multiple civil and criminal proceedings. They lost their positions, their reputations, and their seats on every board they had previously held. Iron Veil Energy quietly withdrew its offer. Several members of the corporate board resigned. Booker Meridian did not recover overnight, but the lights inside the research division came on again. Engineers who had been preparing to leave decided instead to stay. The hospital backup project moved forward. The small suppliers were paid. The fear that had lived in the building was thinning out. Elijah did not consider the recovery of the share price his greatest victory. The moment that mattered to him came on an ordinary afternoon when he passed the door of the research lab and overheard a young engineer say to a colleague, "This is starting to feel like the company I once applied to." Vivian stayed at Booker Meridian. She was no longer the acting chief executive. She had asked to take a different role, one in which she could rebuild what she had once allowed to be hollowed out. The relationship between her and Elijah grew slowly. There was respect first. There was attention second. There was a careful warmth third. Neither of them was in a hurry. A man who has buried the love of his life does not hurry, and a woman who has just learned to apologize does not hurry either. Some things deserve to be built the way the company was first built in the warehouse late at night by hands that have decided to stay. One quiet morning, he brought Zora back to the main lobby. By then, employees had begun to recognize him. They stopped to greet him. But Elijah did not bring his daughter to the lobby to celebrate his return to power. He led her to the same waiting bench where the two of them had once been kept for an hour like strangers. She looked up at him. "Daddy, why are we standing here?" He sat beside her the same way he had sat that morning with one knee bent and one arm around her shoulder. "Because this is the place I want you to remember. Not so you will hate anyone. So you will know something simple. When other people fail to see your worth, you must not forget it yourself." He smoothed one of her braids with the back of his hand, the way his own mother had once smoothed his. "Baby girl, there will be rooms in your life that will not stand up when you walk in, rooms that will look right through you. You walk in anyway, you sit down anyway, and you remember who you are because the room is not the one who decides that. We are." Margaret watched them from her desk. She smiled. She had been there on the day the building first opened. She had seen the company lose its way. Now she had seen the founder come home. Vivian approached. She wore a deep blue dress, simple and elegant, her hair softly tied. She lowered herself to the level of the bench so that her face was even with Zora's. "I did not protect you the last time you were here. I am sorry." Zora looked at her for a long second. Then she lifted her stuffed rabbit and let it touch the back of Vivian's hand. It was not a grand forgiveness. It was the way a small child says that a wound has begun to close. The three of them stood. They walked together to the elevator. The doors slid open. Elijah stepped inside with his daughter's hand in his, and Vivian beside him, and the panel above the door began to rise toward the executive floor. But this time he was no longer a father kept waiting in his own office. He was no longer a man returning to take revenge. He walked back into Booker Meridian as a man who had remembered at last what real power was meant to do. It was meant to protect those who could not protect themselves. If a story like this is worth carrying with you when the screen goes dark, perhaps it is worth carrying these three things. Treat the stranger in the lobby the way you would want someone to treat your own father on the day his shoes are worn down. Do not mistake coldness for strength, and do not mistake softness for weakness, because the people who built what you depend on were almost always softer than they looked. And when life takes you away from the work you were meant to do, give yourself the grace of the absence, but do not forget the road back. Because somewhere, someone is waiting for you to walk through your own front door again, holding the hand of a child who still believes you will always come home.